I'm going to try a new technique tonight. I'm going to sit here and I'm going to hold my tiny mic. So, Merry Christmas. By the time you guys are seeing this, it is going to be late, the day after, maybe 2 days after of Christmas. But I hope you guys have a wonderful time with family and friends and maybe got to go to a church service. I want to talk about voting tonight. And we're going to continue this theme of justice, and our topic is how a Christian ought to vote regarding capital punishment. So I've prepared some notes, and let's just get into it. So, capital punishment, what is it? Well, I'm sure most of you know, but in case you don't know, it is the government's right to take a life as a punishment for a crime, usually a particularly heinous crime. And what kind of crimes is that typically applied to? Well, here in the U.S., it's for capital offenses, which I'm sure you can see where that comes from. And it includes things like aggravated murder, which is usually murder that is paired with some other sort of felony, killing a police officer or even a child. It's also been used for treason, espionage, large-scale drug trafficking, or terrorism, and there's more, but we're going to stop there. And in the United States, 27 states still use it, but 23 have actually abolished it. And not all 27 actively use it, I should say. It's fewer than that, because some of those have placed moratoriums on it. So basically, it's not illegal yet, but they don't, they're not currently using it. Of advanced democracies, only the United States, Japan, Taiwan, and South Korea still retain the use of capital punishment. However, South Korea has placed a moratorium on it, so I'm sure at some point they're going to abolish it as well, which leaves us, Japan, and Taiwan as the only based countries on Earth. I'm sure you can tell which side I take on that, but let's take a glance at the two major camps and see what they think about it. So, the Democratic Party predominantly opposes. There are a fair amount that do support, a sizable minority, but the overwhelming majority of Democrats do oppose, and most of those support the abolition of the death penalty. And the reasons for doing so kind of vary, and it includes, I'm going to give you a few of the reasons, and I'm going to give you kind of my response to each of them. So reason number one is the risk that they could execute an innocent person. So unfortunately, life is not perfect. Innocent people have been executed. And I think this is a valid concern and probably one of the better objections to using capital punishment. But I think you can have rigorous standards to minimize the possibility that an innocent person, and even then we can't entirely, probably can never 100% guarantee that an innocent person will never be executed, but I think you can minimize it to almost nothing, especially with today's incredible technology and all the tools that investigators have at their disposal. The next one is bias, the belief that racial minorities and low-income individuals are more likely to be executed than the opposite. And if this is true, it is unjust. I just want to say that at the fore. But liberals say this kind of thing about literally everything. So this is not as convincing to me as It's just not very convincing to me, especially when you consider that you find more violent crime in poorer areas. Don't hear what I'm not saying, especially with what I'm about to say after this. And I'm not saying because you're poor, you are inherently of less moral value. That is not what I'm saying at all. But poverty is strongly correlated to violent crime or crime of all varieties. And in the United States, we have the inconvenient point where certain minority groups commit crimes at higher rates than others. Many people don't want to confront that fact. I'm not saying any of those minority groups are of lesser moral value than anyone else. You as a black person are not of lesser moral worth than me as a white person. That is not at all what I'm trying to say. I'm simply stating the fact that in the United States, per capita, percentage-wise, black Americans commit more violent crime than white Americans. It's just the way it is. I don't think it has to be that way. I don't think it was always that way. There was a time when they were doing very well, and it was probably more white Americans that were committing their share of the crime. But anyways, moving on. Belief that it is an ineffective deterrent. I think this is completely misconstrued, because what goes on right now when someone receives a death sentence in the United States today, the average time you're going to sit on death row is going to be between 16 to about 22 years. It was not always that way, but right now it is, because as time has gone on, we have extended the appeals process. We have put more and more and more blocks in, because many people obviously want this abolished. And you just have a bunch of people in power, in law, that want to impede the use of this punishment. And they have created an extensive, complicated network of appeals and dragging the process out and costs, which leads to the next reason, which is they think it costs too much, which, yeah, if you're dragging it out over 20 years, it's going to be more expensive, because that lawyer is going to get paid for 20 years. And I guarantee you, if you received a death sentence and by the end of the week you were hanging by a rope, it would publicly, especially, that's probably going to become a pretty strong deterrent for people to do whatever that crime is that got that guy in that position. The fact that many of these people are committing these crimes and going through the legal process for decades and essentially living mostly a full life for the most part before the sentence is carried out, where's the fear in that? And you stand a good chance of your sentence potentially being overturned as well, and not just because you're innocent. Belief that it is a cruel and unusual punishment is the next one, which I think is a pretty weak reason, because that comes out of the cruel and unusual punishment comes out of the 8th Amendment to the Bill of Rights, and that dates back to 1791. Capital punishment has been used for the overwhelming majority of American history. It's been used throughout all of human history, and has really only within the last 100 years been reduced in its use to the point that it is now, where most advanced democracies no longer use it. At the time, the founders were not concerned with the use of capital punishment. They were more concerned with the method of carrying it out, because they were seeing some heinous stuff like drawing and quartering and disembowelment, people getting tied behind a horse and dragged through the streets on their way to their place of execution, all kinds of crazy stuff. And though I personally am a supporter of using capital punishment, I don't think we need to be barbaric about doing it. I'm not one of these people that thinks we need to be putting people up on spikes. We can have a relatively civilized means of doing so without giving up that as a strong deterrent to crime. And I think hanging is a perfectly acceptable method. I don't even think lethal injection, if you want to continue to use it, whatever, I don't even think that is a good method. I think there's nothing wrong with hanging, or a firing squad, or something of that sort, where it's quick and they're not going to sit there and struggle, but you still carry out the sentence. Cost, rope is cheap. And I think it's funny when the Democratic Party is obsessed with spending money in just about every other way, that this is the one exception where they want to cut costs. And government overreach, which is another weird one, is the last reason under the Democrat side. They are concerned that the government should not they think the government should not decide who lives or dies, no matter what the crime. And I actually think the government overreach reason is a valid reason in and of itself. I think the way that they use it is kind of weak because they love bureaucracy. They love creating big, bloated government that wastes trillions of dollars, and they love invading every bit of your personal life. But this is the thing that is a line too far for them. I think that's a weak application of that. But I think that if you personally, you just some stranger I don't know, if you were concerned that the government might have too much power in deciding life or death, especially if you are concerned that the government is becoming tyrannical, then I think that's a very valid concern. Even if I think reasons to the contrary are more weighty, I think that's a valid concern. So anyways, what is the Republican position? Well, they generally support it. They generally tend to be very tough on crime. But there is a sizable portion that are starting to oppose its use and even support abolition from the right. And don't get me wrong, the Catholic Church doesn't neatly fit within either group, but I do tend more often than not to place Catholics in the more conservative camp. I would say they, on average, probably are, that's probably way off, but I'd say on average they're probably center-right in a general sense, just because of their Christian foundation. But the Catholic Church currently opposes capital punishment, and I believe are supporters of abolition, which is odd to me because the Catholic Church, the Pope himself has had an executioner for much of history until recent history, but I know they have their the processes of doctrine developing, and I'm not Catholic, so I can't tell you exactly what the breakdown is on why that is the church position. I just know that's currently how they feel about it, but the Republican positions are generally going to be most of the objections I gave you just now over the reasons that Democrats support this. I'm probably making this really confusing. But anyways, Republicans tend to be tough on crime. They believe that, particularly heinous crimes deserve particularly severe punishments. So generally you're going to see a Republican at least support the use of capital punishment against the crimes that I listed earlier. So, at least certain types of murder, treason, some terrorism, some of the worst. And they do believe it's a deterrence, and I think I've already talked at length enough on that particular one. Preventing reoffense. So, the dead do not reoffend. I think it's a very easy concept to understand. We are at a point right now where we are seeing lenient judges and district attorneys let multiple time offenders, and we're out on the streets, that many of them go on to not just reoffend, but commit even worse crimes. We recently saw a horrific example of this with Irina Zarutska in North Carolina, where she was riding a train home after work, and sadly her life was horrifically taken from her by a 14 arrest. This man was arrested 14 times before he committed this horrible act to that young woman. And at least a couple of those were violent offenses. So there is no reason, and yet he was let out 14 times. So there's no reason that should be happening. And that's actually one of the more low numbers that I've heard. I've seen ones as high as 70, 80 charges or more that are let back out on the street. It's absolutely ridiculous. The idea of personal responsibility is the next reason that you ought to pay for your crimes, and I think that is a very simple idea. To me, this kind of goes with the reoffending one, where when you let someone out, regardless of their crime, and they go on to commit more crime, you are punishing the public. You are showing mercy to the guilty at the expense of the innocent. And that is ridiculous. If you've committed the crime, you ought to do the time. Or you ought to pay with your life if you've committed a horrific enough crime. And then finally, constitutional and religious reasons. The Fifth Amendment, in its wording, assumes the practice of capital punishment, or at least that there are capital crimes that people are going to be charged for. And the law of Moses applies many different crimes that are to be punished with death in the Old Testament. And in the New Testament, Romans chapter 13 is the primary reference for those that are Christians that support the use of capital punishment. And that actually leads into my next segment, which is the breakdown of the Christian view. And we're going to just focus on scriptures that refer to it. I'm not really going to read any of these out, but I've already mentioned Romans 13. As we talk about justice, this is going to be the passage that I refer to time and time again, because this gives earthly government the right to wield the sword. Genesis 9, in God's covenant with Noah after the flood, he commands that those who have committed murder, those who have spilled innocent blood, that their blood must in turn be spilled. That's before the law of Moses was implemented. God singled out that, the commandment that you shall not murder. And yes, that is the correct translation. So, biblically speaking, there is a difference between taking an innocent life and taking a life in certain circumstances. Self-defense, murder, war. There are specific words that distinguish these different particular instances of taking a life. And we are not to murder. There are certain times where it is unfortunate, but it is acceptable and even necessary to kill. Exodus 21:12, so just one chapter after the commandments are given, it reiterates that those who have taken life are for their lives to be taken. Leviticus 24 clarifies that the laws, in a larger discussion of how to deal with people who have taken, human life or animal life or whatever, that all these laws are to be applied not just to those who belong to the Hebrew nation, but also to strangers. So all these people that love to bring up old scripture references and how we ought to treat strangers, right there, it says that the stranger is to be held to the same laws as the natives. So if a stranger, if an immigrant, of whether legal or otherwise, has committed a crime or especially heinous crimes, their lives are forfeit as well. Numbers 35:33 kind of gives us a little more context and tells us that the reason that this heavy sentence is supposed to be carried out is because innocent blood pollutes the land. That's the language that's used. And the only way to atone for that is by spilling the blood of the one who spilled that innocent blood. And Proverbs 6:16 through 19, God here, it lists a number of things that God considers as abominations, things that God particularly hates more than other sins. And among those are hands that shed innocent blood. And people will counter with passages like, Matthew 5:38 through 42, where we get the whole turn the other cheek teaching. But there's a couple important things to remember when people try to hit you with this. And number one, that is that Christ is God. So the same God that was handing down those Old Testament rulings is the same God sitting on the Mount, giving the Sermon of the Mount. And he does not contradict himself. He does not change. So how do we make these two things, how do we reconcile these two things, that at certain times we're to turn the cheek and other times we are supposed to execute the wicked? And that is because in this instance, Christ is talking about our private, personal enemies. He's not talking about the government. You, the Christian, when you are insulted, are to turn the other cheek. You, as a police officer, when someone is threatening another's life, are to take that offender's life. You, as the executioner, when you swing the sword, you are doing a righteous duty, biblically speaking. And remember, all scripture is God-breathed. So later in Romans 13, when we come to Paul discussing that the governing authorities have the right to swing that sword, he is not contradicting Christ and his teachings. Paul was quite aware of Christ's teachings. He had spent time with the apostles with the other apostles, because Paul was an apostle as well. I guarantee you this was probably something they discussed. So all that leads to my final verdict, which may surprise you, but I actually think this particular one, as much as I personally am in support, I think this is a bit of a toss-up. I think you as a Christian, this is somewhere where we have a bit of Christian liberty. I think the Old Testament, it does apply, but not necessarily everything is prescriptive. I think we can glean a lot of wisdom from seeing that God has seen fit to command the death penalty in certain circumstances, but that is not necessarily that we are to carry it out in every instance in today's government of our nations. I think if you are not comfortable with the potential risk to innocent lives being lost, then, and that weighs heavy on your conscience, I think it is understandable why you might cast a vote in the other direction that I might on this particular issue, as someone who I would say it's not that I'm not concerned for the potential loss of innocent life, but I think right now in our particular point in history, we are at a greater risk of greater evil if we do not swing this sword than if we are swinging it too much. I think right now we have a lot of chaos and crime that is rampant in our nation, and criminals are not afraid to go and commit more crime, and particularly heinous crime, and that must be corrected. And there's a lot of innocent blood being spilled over and over and over again that is essentially receiving no real serious punishment. So I think execution is the way that we need to, and swift execution, and if you ask me, public execution. And I don't say that to have some kind of gross enjoyment of it, but it is to strike terror into the evildoers. I think we can take away a couple of non-negotiables from this, and that is that, as we've already discussed, that Romans 13 shows, the government has legitimate authority. So if your government is carrying out capital punishment, you do not get to object to that as a method that government uses. That is a legitimate method, which also leads to my second and final point, which is that you can oppose capital punishment on grounds of your personal conscience, but you do not get to label capital punishment as immoral. You don't get to cast it as evil. Because to cast capital punishment as evil is to cast God as evil, because God has not just commanded its use at points in the Old Testament, he himself has taken life. And you might say, oh, well, that's God. Yes, it is, but God is a perfect moral being, the only perfect moral being. If there was something inherently wrong with taking a life under any circumstances, and God took a life, that would make God not a heretic. That would make God a hypocrite, which we know he is not, because he is the standard by which all rules and morality are measured. So with that, go and enjoy Christian liberty. I love you guys, whether you agree with me or disagree with me. I'm very interested to hear your thoughts. Thank you very much for listening, and we will see you next time.